moving on very quickly to the next segment, and this next segment is going to be talking about building sustainable international businesses. We have some very carefully selected individuals who are experts in their chosen fields to please talk about this. And I'd like to just very quickly invite Ms. Karine Matsiko Taylor, the head trade finance DP World Sub-Saharan Africa. Can we please invite her over to the side of the divide? Please, a warm round of applause for her. She makes her way here. Thank you very much. Please, feel free. We then also want to invite Ms. Sanya Alleyne, the CEO, Chamber of Industry and Commerce, St. Kitts and Nevis, to also please take her seat on the side. Is all women's affair, if you ask my candid opinion. And to moderate this very esteemed session, it is my honor and privilege to invite our moderator, Ms. Enene Ejembi. Can we please welcome her with a resounding applause as well? And by the way, I must confess that this trio have something in common. Apart from their professional fields, they have very irresistible sets of dentition. Can we please applaud them one more time? Can't you see that? Am I right? Did I say it right? They are beautiful. Thank you very much. All right, very quickly, I'll just bring us up to speed with our moderator. Enene Ejembi is a global development leader whose early career in retail banking and expertise in strategy execution informs her work advancing progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. She has led teams that deliver technical assistance in economic growth, health systems, and strengthening governance reform and education development across Nigeria. Over the years, she has worked with global and development firms and donor agencies, including DAI, Malaria Consortium, Tetra Tech, and the United Nations Global Compact, USAID, and the UK Foreign as well as Commonwealth and Development Office. Today she leads her own international development consulting firm, Verbatim Virtual Solutions, driving impact through strategy execution and donor partnerships. A Gates Foundation goalkeeper, that should be Melinda Gates, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation goalkeeper. Enene is a trustee on the board of Accountability Laboratory, a global civil society organization focused on open governance and accountability. She holds a BA in English Literature from the prestigious University of Jos, Nigeria, and an in a Master's in Literature in English Studies from the University of Dundee, United Kingdom, and professional certifications from the Knowledge Management Institute, Washington, D.C., United States of America. Her career reflects a commitment to improving the material condition of citizens, fostering collaboration and strengthening governance systems to creating sustainable changes. Very distinguished ladies and gentlemen, very lengthy and intimidating resume, but have decided to abridge it. So I hand over proceedings at this point in time to Ms. Enene Ejembi, our moderator. Thank you very much. Please a warm round of applause for them.
Thank you, Andy Gabriel. I'll start by saying a big thank you to the Aquarian team led by Aisha Maina for this wonderful event, and to our focus country. Thank you for being our guests and for coming with your A game. We look forward to a great conversation. If we call an all-male panel a manel, what do we call an all-female panel? A womanel? Femme panel? Powernel. I like that. So let's give it to them. I'll start by introducing Sanya Alleyne, right next to me. She's the Executive Director of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce at St. Kitts and Nevis. And she's an experienced trade policy specialist. She's a legal advisor. She's also an educator. She has a passion for public policy and international law. She's experienced in diplomacy, international law, governance, trade policy, and development. and she has a proven track record in the provision of regulatory advice, capacity building, project management, and operations. She has academic grounding in law, trade policy, international relations, and education. Now that's power if we ever saw it. And we have Karen Matsiko Taylor, who's joining us from South Africa. She's a Senior Director, Trade Finance, Sub-Saharan Africa with DP World. She's an esteemed figure in banking and logistics, currently leading trade finance for DP World's Sub-Saharan African business. And she has over 2 decades of experience in finance, including a tenure on Wall Street at several top-tier firms. And she developed an interest in sustainable trends in emerging markets and relocated to Africa to bridge funding gaps in business. Now we have 2 experts. Please give them a round of applause. And I think that this is a good composition, considering we're talking about sustainable business. We have a trade policy expert, and we have a trade finance expert. So I'll just set the context for us. We're talking about building sustainable businesses, and we're not only talking about profitability, although that is very essential, but we're also talking about businesses that are profitable over the long term and can maintain that through their business practices, their compliance, their funding, their financing, all of that. But we also want to talk about social sustainability. So are these enterprises resilient? Are they inclusive? Are they ethical? And will they leave the social structure more cohesive than before? Are they environmentally sustainable? Do they have practices that will protect ecosystems, ensure resource stewardship for next generations? So we're going to touch on all of these elements, but our main focus today is long-term regional impact and profitability. We're going to look at trade, we're going to look at investment, we're going to look at identity-driven enterprise, like we've talked about our shared culture and history. We're also going to talk about financing systems, because these are still emerging markets. And while we do have frameworks like AFA, like we learned today, OECS, CARICOM, ECOWAS, we know that the potential of all of these arrangements are not yet fully utilized, so they'll be bringing their expertise to talk to us. So there's an opportunity here to forge new paths rooted in our shared identity and cross-regional collaboration. So let's explore how. Sanya's expertise is in trade policy, so she'll focus on that. I would like to ask you, Sanya, what are the biggest trade policy or ecosystem shifts in your experience that are needed to be unlocked for us to have sustainable business growth, not only in the Caribbean, but also in partnership with Africa?
Good morning, everyone. And thank you for the question. The presenter before me would have done a very comprehensive overview of the various mechanisms that can be implemented. But I would like to focus on one in particular. He would have made mention of the need to possibly engage in negotiations for a free trade arrangement, a preferential free trade arrangement. And I think that's one of the biggest policy shifts that can facilitate further liberalization of goods and services and investment between the regions. And if we were to drill down into what that could look like, we can look at facilitating liberalization across goods which are considered to be specifically beneficial to each region to be able to trade in. So the statistics indicate that less than 1% of trade is occurring between the CARICOM region and the African continent. And this doesn't indicate that there isn't a possibility that this can grow. It just means that, one, as indicated by the Honorable Minister, we need greater trade data. Additionally, we need to be able to undertake further exploratory missions to be able to inform the negotiation of said trade agreement. But let me take a step back and let's go back into the framework of this trade agreement. So liberalizing goods, looking at particular sectors, ensuring that if we're going to liberalize trading goods, agricultural goods or agro-processed goods or finished goods, that we identify specific sensitive sectors for which we may facilitate phased-in liberalization, or build protections around those sensitive sectors, right? Agriculture tends to be one, but perhaps we could look at where we can liberalize certain agricultural goods to facilitate meaningful trade and build and feeding into regional and global value chains. Additionally, liberalizing trade in services. So we've spoken about tourism, we've spoken about cultural and creative services, but we also have to look at financial services, right? There's a possibility there for liberalization to encourage investment. And we also have to look at how can we get to the nitty-gritty trade policy mechanisms. So the speaker yesterday would have mentioned the waiver of visas. And this can be facilitated through either an absolute waiver or looking at specific intra-corporate transferee categories or business support categories, whereby you could facilitate visa-free entry of professionals, looking at particular sectors of interest. So education services, as I would have mentioned yesterday, tourism services, and also, if I may, even look at possibly construction and agriculture, agricultural services, like knowledge transfer. Taking a step forward, we can look at investment as well. If I recall, the speaker before us was speaking about in the framework of that free trade arrangement, making arrangements for an investment chapter. That's a possibility. Or possibly engaging in a bilateral trade investment treaty and carving out provisions that would encourage and incentivize not only investment promotion, but itself protecting investors' rights, right? And so I would rest here, I won't bore persons any further, but it is important to consider the negotiation of such a framework, because that will set the pace and open up market access within the region and amongst the region. Thanks.
Excellent. She talked about, please, a round of applause. Yes, it is in order. She talked about preferential free trade. I love that word. So it's not just trade liberalization, which is what it is, but we want those preferential agreements and arrangements that will allow us to trade more. She talked about visa-free travel, and yesterday I found out that actually travel from Nigeria, for Nigerian citizens, into St. Kitts and Nevis is actually visa-free. So where you need a visa is when you're transiting through another country where you require a visa. So a round of applause, that's great that that's there. And I think part of what we need to do is also to increase awareness of where we already have some preferential situations where we can leverage between our two nations. Thank you very much, Alleyne. I'll come to you, Karen, and I will like to pick your brain about trade finance. So how can we ensure trade finance also prioritizes inclusive development goals, especially for women-led small businesses, youth-led businesses as well?
Thank you. I think before we get into the technical and the technical dimensions of trade and investment, I think it's imperative to acknowledge that people should really be at the center of everything. It's a universal truth, you know. Whether we are speaking of ESG or we are speaking about economic transformation building, none of that can happen without people. And in South Africa, we encapsulate it in the philosophy of Ubuntu, which means I am because we are, right? So as much as ESG thrives on people, legacy is carried forward by people. And a strategy may set the direction, but it's really the people ultimately who execute and refine and carry on the legacy. So I'll come to that point, but I think it's very important to kind of build a construct. So there are certain things that, you know, we all know that Africa is abundant with resources, and I can assure you, everyone in this room is looking for the right partner. And I think that is imperative when we're thinking of building sustainable businesses. And the 5 reflections on really how to define trajectory of enterprises is identifying the right stakeholders. I think Nigerians St. Kitts and Nevis onto something, you know. I think instead of it being a marriage of convenience, we can think of it as an ordained by God marriage, you know, where we know it will carry forward. building the right team. I think yesterday someone on Miss Minor's team talked about, with pride and conviction in believing in her vision. And that's the reason why her business has been able to thrive for 16 years plus. Investing in relationships, that is really the true currency of long-term relationships. And planning for legacy. Someone recently told me, and I quote, "Without legs, legacy doesn't travel." So succession planning is really important. And going back to your question, about how can we make sure that trade finance is inclusive for women and youth. Unfortunately, the financial system was not built for small businesses. And that's why I make it a point to sit in rooms talking to the youth and women on how to prepare themselves when trying to seek funding. So one of the things is, digitizing your access, making sure that you have records for credit, because that is the one thing that a bank or financial institution will look at and say, you don't have a history of credit, therefore I cannot lend you money. So I know women tend to want to do everything, but that's the one thing you need to let go of is outsource the financial aspect. So that is taken care of by an auditing firm or even a small, I'm sure someone knows someone who knows a CA who can be able to build that. So being able to tell your story through a financial model is going to be one of the ways that trade financing is second to nature for banks to be able to lend out. One of the things I really talk about is digitizing, everything. Someone talked about blockchain. If we don't jump on that bandwagon, I remember speaking about blockchain about 15 years ago on Wall Street, and people thought I was crazy, and now it's a big thing. If you did not get onto it then, you're now trying to catch up. So trying to catch up with AI, basically equip yourself to make sure that you're able to be at the same wavelength as multinationals, even if you're a small business. I think that is a way to really tackle it. And to me, I think it's not using a one paintbrush fits all. I think very often financial institutions like to do that. At my former employer, ABSA, we had specific criteria for women and youth. That was not really eliminating everything, but we kind of had soft, criteria whilst mitigating risk ultimately, because we're not a charity. So I think having the tools and packaging your product in such a way that it is competitive, I think is a way to tackle into the trade finance market.
Excellent. So that speaks exactly to what we're trying to say, that it's more inclusive so that it doesn't lower the bar, but it works with proxies that give you the same financial information that you need for your records and for your controls, but then you are able to fund traditionally excluded businesses and enterprises. Thank you. We'll go to talk about governance. And I'll speak to Sanya because with your current role, you have a lot of experience in terms of chambers of commerce. What role can you say they play in bridging the policy gap between what the private sector needs and what we need to make sure these regional agreements actually lead to increased business and prosperity?
So yesterday, I said a mouthful. And one of the things I would have indicated is that private sector requires a seat at the table when it comes to policy development. And I would have indicated that in St. Kitts and Nevis, there is a good model of good governance of including the private sector in every dialogue on every policy that is being developed. I think what needs to occur is enhancing that. So I would advocate for that particular model, not only just in St. Kitts and Nevis, but outside in the wider Caribbean. And also, I cannot speak to the states within the African continent, but that level of internal coordination, involvement and engagement. And so what the Chamber's role then is to coordinate its members, obtain data and information that would assist the government in being able to design policies, strategies that not only support private sector, but is informed by the private sector. Because at the end of the day, it's the adage we all use in trade policy. Government does not trade, businesses, well, apparently the panel, everyone has fallen asleep except us on the panel. So I'm going to try that again. Government does not trade, but businesses. Okay, well, I see it seems not everybody knows, but businesses trade and businesses engage in trade. And so this is what is essential. Another aspect for, I would say, the chamber is to ensure that information is shared. We go back to the issue of the information deficit, and that is what seems to be a significant barrier to being able to incentivize private sector to export. They do not know what are the opportunities. They do not know about the various trade agreements. They do not know about the different, let's say, duty-free access or opportunities to even tap into global or regional value chains. And so the chambers have a responsibility to gather, obtain information, store information, share information, but also collaborate with other chambers, because I was making mention of that yesterday as well, in the context of the regional fora. So for the Caribbean, we have two frameworks in which we regionally collaborate as chambers. There is the OECS Business Council, which is a construct that has come out of the OECS Commission, which is the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And then there is CARICHAM, which is a construct or a network of chambers across the region under the framework of the Caribbean community. And we share information. We support each other's activities as well. So if a chamber has one training capacity, training initiative occurring, they share that information amongst the other chambers to encourage their members to actually undertake the training as well. So capacity building is also critical in terms of being able to support private sector to not only maximize its benefits, but also to become more empowered through information to do exactly what you were suggesting, improving on their financial management, being able to undertake their own market intelligence. And I would end by saying chambers also have a responsibility to support each other with trade missions. So at this point in time, I probably shouldn't even announce this, but we are engaging bilaterally with other chambers in the region to facilitate trade missions into St. Kitts and Nevis, and for our private sector to go into those particular markets. And I think that is really and honestly a more meaningful and tangible way that we can be beneficial. And I would be eager to engage with the Nigeria Chamber to facilitate a similar initiative. And I think this is how we get rubber hitting the road. And I'll end here.
A round of applause for her. I think that is absolutely amazing. So information dissemination, collaborating on trade missions, not only within the Caribbean, but now also with Africa. And I think that is, like you say, one of the ways that we can get things going. Excellent. Thank you very much, Sanya. I'll come to you, Karen. What barriers do businesses face in securing trade finance? We know that the global financial architecture has not been fair to African nations, right? So we know about those barriers. Speak a little bit to what the barriers are, but also tell us what innovations or policies are helping to close that divide.
Absolutely. So you're absolutely right about the KYC. Part of that, the barriers for trade finance, and some of them are the high collateral requirements, where you go to a bank and they're asking for your kidney or buildings or whatever that typically small businesses would not have. I make fun of it, but it's such a big thing for SMEs. And I talk about SMEs because an SME in Africa is not the same SME in the UAE. I was in a discussion about 3 weeks ago, and a small SME in the UAE is a turnover of $67.5 million US.
Okay.
So now we need to understand and make it bespoke to African SMEs. And Africa, we would still need to dissect it to Nigeria, to Ghana, to Senegal, to South Africa, to Swaziland, wherever. But also, that is an issue, high collateral requirements, the stringent KYC requirements that, quote unquote, the Western world likes to have, but we need to be able to speak up and say, we might not have what you're asking, but this is an alternative to whatever you're asking for. So that is my role as an African in a global business, advocating to make sure that things are changed. The lack of formal credit history I spoke about, that is a real issue. I find it particularly higher in the agri-sector, where there's really a hunger to do business, but because farmers, as an example, just don't have the time to take care of their finances, that is where an issue is. And the perceived risk in emerging markets. I think people like the idea of doing business in Africa. It's sexy, but they don't really understand Africa, and then they start to pull away. So if you understand the opportunities, but also the risks, but the risk mitigants, I think that's where businesses can thrive. And I think this is something that, unfortunately, the African countries, including Nigeria, have faced, the currency and political volatility. That is a real issue. How do we fix that, though? There are so many ways on how to fix it, and supply chain finance is something that I really thrive on, because we just shouldn't look at the big corporates, but the suppliers, the smaller suppliers under, that is who we should be funding. And we have a supply chain program in my organization that I'm really focused on, to push for farmers, to push for businesses that could typically not stand alone and get financing, but as a consortium, we're able to fund them. Having trade insurance, that is way to mitigate risk. I was recently at an X-Cred event, and insurance is something that if African entities can focus on that and be able to support our businesses, that would be critical in ensuring that the issues I'd spoken about are fixed. Blockchain and open account systems, we keep talking about the AFCFTA, but we need to implement from an open account perspective where, because we're neighbors, we don't need to get guarantees and credits, but it's really built on trust. And one of the ways on doing that is having a blockchain system where there's transparency. Everyone can see from cradle to grave what's happening, meaning there's little interference or a risk of fraud. So I think jumping on the blockchain, I find that the younger generation is much more receptive to it, but it's something that if we can harness it, it can boom and bring a lot of businesses for our continent.
Excellent. Thank you very much. A round of applause for her. She's talked about blockchain technology, business insurance, supply chain finances as some of the innovations that can address the issues. I want to dig a little bit deeper, because you talked about the perception of risk. And I think that's one of the biggest opportunities and reasons why it makes sense for us that look like each other to do business with each other, because we're both on the short end of the stick when it comes to that. Would you say that the perception of risk is real, or would you say that it is blown out of proportion, and what do we need to do?
I want to say it's actually real.
Okay.
And I'll say this from my previous roles, not my current role, because, let's talk about working in the banking industry. There's so much opportunity in Africa. And I focused on emerging markets in college just to understand the perception. So you'll have an investor come in and say, I need you to lend out $100 million US to an African entity. But the requirements they ask for are impossible, And that's the reason why we need to be advocates for each other as African entities to say, actually, I can vouch for a Nigerian firm. I think Nigeria, one of the strengths is from a risk perspective, most of the banks actually can come to Nigeria and learn how to mitigate risk,
yes,
because risk is so low, yes, from a Nigeria perspective. So I think leveraging best practices is something that's critical. I think in South Africa, one of the things I was privy to last year was we were sent to Singapore to try and get best practices. Having a blueprint on something where you don't move away from that blueprint. You can tweak around it, but it stays. And that's why I think Singapore has been able to thrive for the past 50 years, because that blueprint stays regardless of new government coming in. So we need to understand that no one is coming to save us. We are actually here, and this room can change it, but it starts with trust. It starts with fostering relationships where it's not just in it for me, but how can I help my sister or my brother to ensure that they thrive, to take it to international levels, So I think we need to understand that, Afro-Caribbean, this is it, because we need to build our own legacy and not rely, as we can see, on quote-unquote aid that is now starting to dwindle.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The imperative thing, no one is coming to save us. I heard Dangote say that last year at the UN General Assembly when we were having the Global Africa Business Initiative, and I think that message is diffusing widely, and so we're saving ourselves.
Yes, ma'am.
We are coming to the end of this panel. We want to talk a little bit about cultural identity. So I'll ask the same question to the both of you, and as you give us your response, give us your final words as well. Can you share an example from your work where cultural identity helped build trust and secure a partnership? And I really want us to talk about trust because Karen is big on values, so am I. And a lot of times we think that economic development is going to happen through technical solutions alone. A big part of it rests on our value system and how much we can align. So share an example from your work where cultural identity helped build trust and secure a partnership.
Cultural identity. So I would consider myself a global citizen because I've lived in Botswana, Uganda, Zambia, the US, and now in South Africa. So having to take care of businesses spanning across 48 countries in Africa, you need to understand their culture. Just don't go in expecting to impose, I think in every country, in East Africa as an example, I can apply the same thing in Kenya as I can to Uganda, even if they're neighbors. We need to understand the nuances and respect their culture. So to me, it's not going with savior mentality per se, but how can I leverage my experience, but also you help me understand your culture, because I am South African. I hadn't lived in South Africa. And going there, I had to learn how to understand the culture. I got a coach because I came from New York and everything was, strict and go. And in South Africa, they have a different approach. And I had to respect that. Even if I'm South African, I didn't really grow up in the South African culture, but it was imperative for me to learn the culture in order to thrive. And by me learning culture is where I built trust, where people said, you get me, therefore I can trust you. So that is really the base of it, understanding culture.
Excellent. A round of applause. She's hit on something fundamental, which is that to build trust, you must go in with respect. Mutual respect is the foundation of trust. And I'll come to you, Sanya. Same question. Can you share an example from your work where cultural identity helped build trust or secure a partnership?
So I think we have a similar story. So I won't go too much into my similar story. I've lived also in different locations. I've lived in Trinidad. I'm actually from Trinidad and Tobago. I've lived in Barbados. I have lived in Switzerland, and I have also now live in St. Kitts and Nevis. And yes, you have to respect and understand different cultures, not only for your professional life, but even for interpersonal relationships, because business is about interpersonal relationships. It's about not only just trust, but a sense of community, a sense of closeness, a sense of understanding. So I do feel you there. But outside of that, and also I've worked with international organizations, so my way of doing business is different. So I had to tailor that to meet the needs of my various stakeholders. But to come out of the personal side of it, I would like to widen it a bit and look at it also from the perspective, if I may, of the Caribbean. So how does the Caribbean do business with the world? Tapping into its own identity. And I would say the cultural aspect of the Caribbean, right? And particularly in relation to St. Kitts and Nevis, looking at sugar mass, right? Looking at the traditional carnival characters, the distinct type of soca, and also the warmth of the people. That authenticity assists in being able to promote, market the goods of St. Kitts and Nevis, but more so, it allows persons to connect, just like how I, as an individual, have to connect with others in a genuine and authentic way. And I think that is what assists countries to be able to brand their product according to its nationality. So the Caribbean has been looking at the Caribbean brand, or brand Caribbean, for authentically Caribbean. I think it was the terminology of the brand for some time. And underneath that, each island started to develop its brand. So St. Kitts, it is Follow Your Heart. Nevis is Nevis Nice, which I must say I love that particular brand. Grenada is Pure Grenada. And these things, therefore, tie not only into the geographical uniqueness of the territory, but it also provides one with that sense of quality, of luxury. And I think that's how you leverage the authenticity of your community and your culture towards being able to build a brand that is globally recognized.
Excellent, excellent. A round of applause for both of these distinguished panelists. We've explored how sustainable business means more than just profit. It's about transformation, it's about policy coherence, it's about funding that can be accessed, and it's about identity-driven growth. We've talked about the need to negotiate preferential trade agreements, consider visa-free travel, which with Nigeria and St. Kitts and Nevis we do have. We talked about digitizing financial records so that you can access, leveraging technologies such as blockchain, and chambers of commerce and the role that they play in fostering the growth of enterprises so that they can grow to be more sustainable internationally and doing trade across our various regions. As somebody deeply inspired by somebody born in Nevis, Alexander Hamilton, I would be remiss if I didn't leave you with a quote from the Broadway musical. There's a million things we haven't done together, but just you wait. Just you wait. We are young, we are scrappy, we are hungry, and we're not going to throw away this shot. Please, a round of applause for this panel.
Please, can we applaud them one more time?